Hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm Megan Van Emmen, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University, and today we're going to be discussing the importance of macrominerals for beef cattle production. Now, as shown previously in our general mineral requirements video, these are our macrominerals that are considered essential and that we have established requirements for, all represented in percent. So calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. Now, we don't have a chloride requirement, and we assume that we're meeting those chloride requirements when we supplement salt or sodium chloride in our beef cattle diets. So looking here at our classes of cattle, we do not have any bull requirements, just our gestating and early lactating cows, and then our growing and finishing cattle. So we use the growing and finishing cattle requirements for our bulls. Now, one thing to keep in mind is during early lactation, we have an increase in calcium, magnesium, and potassium requirements due to the lactational demand. Only a slight increase with our sodium. And then one thing to point out is that we do have sulfur requirements, even though we typically don't add sulfur in as a separate ingredient for our mineral supplements, but it is required on 0.15% for all classes of cattle. Where we want to be careful is not to exceed the 0.4% sulfur in a diet, which could lead to negative impacts on production, as well as other mineral requirements. So if we move into calcium and phosphorus, considering them together, usually just because we look at more of a calcium to phosphorus ratio than as separate requirements. So as pointed out previously, calcium and phosphorus are major constituents of bone, as well as then calcium with major functions in muscle, as well as phosphorus in metabolic functions such as fat metabolism, protein metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism. Now, speaking of a calcium to phosphorus ratio, optimal would be 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1. Now, we generally consider 2 to 1 being the optimum ratio. However, we don't see a reduction in performance until we get into a ratio of greater than 6 to 1. One thing to keep in mind for our cattle is that calcium is generally adequate in most of our forages, especially our legumes. Therefore, we tend to see calcium deficiency issues in those animals that are being fed concentrate-based diets, such as in the feedlot. Now, the opposite is true for phosphorus. We generally have adequate concentrations in most of our grains or cereal grains, with deficiency symptoms being noted more in our forage-based diets. As our calcium to phosphorus ratio exceeds 10 to 1, we can start to see reductions in growth, feed efficiency, and reproduction. And this can also result in bone or wood chewing. Now, as we reduce calcium and we have a ratio closer to 1 to 1, we can once again see that reduced feed intake and growth. But the big one is what's known as urinary calculi or water belly. Typically seen in steers. You can, however, see it in some dry-lotted heifers. So we worry about this mainly in our feedlot sector. And that's basically because those steers or other livestock are not able to urinate, so their belly gets big and swollen and looks like they have a bunch of water in their belly. With a prolonged 1 to 1 ratio, we see the reduced growth, feed efficiency, and reproduction as well. Now, there are several different products that are available to meet our calcium and phosphorus requirements, and one being animal byproducts such as fish meal or meat and bone meal are high in both calcium and phosphorus. We also have the other ingredients included in some of our mineral supplements, such as calcium carbonate, dicalcium phosphate, limestone and sodium phosphate. But the big one is making sure that we're meeting that optimum 2 to 1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus for our livestock. Now for potassium, we need a daily dietary inclusion of potassium because we don't have a lot of appreciable reserves in the body. And supplementation of potassium is most important for those ruminants in the feedlot situation being fed high concentrate diets. We typically don't need potassium supplementation during peak forage growth, especially in those grazing ruminants, unless we have animals that are under some stress, such as by heat or during peak milk lactation. Those are the type of stressful events where we would want to make sure our mineral supplement contains a potassium source. Now, for our grazing ruminants on our mature pastures, such as in late summer, fall and winter, potassium levels in those forages are relatively low, and we would want to make sure that we are providing a potassium source in our mineral supplement, as well as if we're feeding hay that was rained on or overly matured in the field prior to baling. This could also lead to low potassium levels in those forages, and we would want to make sure that while we're feeding those, that we're providing a potassium source in our mineral supplement. Now, a few sources here for potassium. Cool season grasses tend to have a greater potassium concentration than our warm season grasses. One thing we can note is that due to this increased potassium in our cool season grasses and even some legumes, we can accelerate an onset of grass tetany due to the inhibition of magnesium absorption by potassium, which we'll cover here in a little bit with magnesium. Our energy sources, such as our concentrates, as stated previously, are typically low in potassium, hence why we would want to have a potassium source for those feedlot animals. Our protein sources are relatively high, and then things in our mineral supplements, such as molasses, tend to have a greater amount of potassium available for the livestock needs, as well as then a separate potassium source within those commercial supplements. Now with magnesium, it's extremely important for bone and teeth integrity. Magnesium is also involved in more than 300 enzymatic steps, as well as activating phosphate transferring and enzymes within the Krebs cycle, as well as fatty acid synthesis. Now, we typically think of magnesium during our kind of spring months, as our grasses are starting to get green and lush, they're starting to rapidly grow, and aren't adequate in magnesium concentrations for our cattle that we're about ready to turn out onto grass, especially those that have just calved and are heading towards peak lactation. Typically, magnesium deficiency, also known as hypomagnesemia, occurs in our grazing ruminants during spring calving, a few weeks after calving when those cows are reaching peak lactation, and the grass does not have adequate concentrations of magnesium to help meet that magnesium demand of lactation. We can also see it in grazing ruminants and calves that are reared too long on milk alone without access to any other feeds, so no other magnesium sources, and in those older ruminants that are out grazing that are just unable to mobilize skeletal magnesium due to increasing age. But the typical one is we worry about that springtime grass tetany issues, just due to that lush green grass not having adequate magnesium concentrations, and then those grazing cattle during lactation. We can also bring about hypomagnesemia if we change from an adequate magnesium diet to a deficient magnesium diet abruptly. This can also what we consider grass tetany or hypomagnesemia. We can also have what's known as winter tetany with our mature forages, or if we're feeding forages that are high in potassium and low in calcium and magnesium, we can bring about very similar symptoms to grass tetany. We just call it winter tetany because it tends to occur during the winter months when we're feeding those harvested forages. Our grass and cereal grains tend to be low in magnesium and high in potassium. Average magnesium concentrations are typically below 0.12% in our harvested forages. The that are grass and cereal grain based. The typical source that we include in some of our commercial supplements is magnesium oxide, and we have to include it with a supplement because of its palatability issues. It's extremely bitter, and cattle will not consume magnesium oxide as a single source magnesium supplement. Now, as we move on to sodium chloride, once again, we're going to consider these two together because they work hand in hand in maintaining pH, osmolarity, and cellular volume. Salt or sodium chloride helps promote water intake, which helps then promote feed intake. It works for nutrient transport. But one thing to keep in mind, salt shouldn't be included at more than 8% of the total diet. And we can use salt to control intake, especially of our self-fed supplements. Salt's an excellent tool to help get our intake in that target range, especially for some of our cakes or pellets that, are recommended at, 1 to 2 pounds per head per day. We can utilize salt to help reach that optimum intake. Now for sulfur, although we don't include it with some of our commercial supplements, it is a requirement for our livestock, and that's mainly due to insulin, which contains disulfide bonds, oxytocin formation. Sulfur is also a main constituent of biotin and thiamine, as well as some amino acids. We don't typically worry about sulfur deficiency, we worry about sulfur toxicity. And sulfur toxicity can have some whole-scale animal effects on our trace minerals, as well as other areas such as cytochrome C oxidase. The issue is that sulfide blocks cytochrome C oxidase, so therefore we have a reduction in oxygen carrying capacity within the animal. It can also interfere with selenium metabolism, but sulfur can also reduce the availability of some other trace minerals such as molybdenum and copper due to the formation of thiomolybdates within the rumen, rendering copper and molybdenum unabsorbed, and therefore we could also lead to copper deficiency issues. Sulfur toxicity can increase hydrogen sulfide production within the rumen, therefore leading to what's known as polioencephalomalacia, which mainly affects the central nervous system. It causes dullness, blindness, muscle tremors, and it's mainly characterized by those animals blindly circling. They'll start head pressing, and in severe cases, they'll start convulsing and collapse within 12 to 72 hours. So the main treatment is to remove the sulfur source, whether that's both the water and feed. So cereal grains tend to be low in sulfur concentrations, but our oil seeds and molasses tend to be relatively high, especially some of our byproduct feeds, such as dried distillers grains, tend to be high in sulfur concentrations. So if you're feeding those high sulfate containing feeds, as well as then have a high sulfate water source, those impacts can be additive. Both those sources will accumulate and can cause sulfur toxicity issues. So having those forages and water tested before feeding or turning those cattle into that pasture water source can really help determine if we could see some sulfate issues. Because forages and water are highly variable in sulfate. So these are just a few sulfur sources that can help meet those requirements, but we just need to be careful that we're not overfeeding sulfur. So just a few things to wrap up here. So calcium is generally low in concentrates. Phosphorus is generally low in forages. Maintaining that optimum 2-to-1 ratio helps to get optimal production out of our cattle. Potassium has decreased concentrations in our mature forages, so having that potassium source during that time of grazing those mature forages can really help meet those potassium needs. We typically worry about magnesium in the spring as our pastures are growing and becoming lush and green, and our cattle are reaching that peak lactation. And then we worry about sulfur toxicity for both water and our feed sources, and this can cause polioencephalomalacia and can also inhibit copper and molybdenum absorption in the rumen due to the formation of thiomolybdates. With that, I'm Megan Van Emmen, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University. Thanks and have a great day.